Those thoughts are completely understandable, but they're usually based on one assumption that simply isn't true. And that's the belief that progress should happen in a smooth, predictable, straight line. Are you ready to get back to what you love after knee replacement? The Total Knee Success Podcast is your trusted guide with practical tips, evidence-based strategies, and no fluff. It's not personal medical advice, just solid education to help you manage pain, regain mobility, and get back to living the life you love. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the Total Knee Success Podcast. I'm Michelle. Have you ever had one of those moments when you finally felt like your knee was beginning to cooperate? Maybe you walked a little farther than you had the week before, climbed the stairs with a little more confidence, or made it through the afternoon without thinking about your knee every few minutes. For the first time in a while, it seemed as though all the hard work was beginning to pay off. Then you woke up the next morning, stood up beside the bed, and everything felt different again. Your knee was stiffer, more swollen, and walking suddenly felt awkward again. Within a few minutes, your confidence might have disappeared because it seemed as though all of your progress had vanished overnight. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why one difficult day rarely tells the whole story of your overall progress after knee replacement. And you'll know how to tell the difference between a normal setback and a situation that might deserve some medical attention. If that experience sounds familiar, I want you to know you're far from alone. In fact, it's one of the most common conversations I have with people after knee replacement. Someone might tell me that they were finally turning a corner, only to feel discouraged because their knee suddenly became more painful or more swollen for no obvious reason. They begin replaying everything they did over the past day or two, searching for the one thing that must have caused the problem. Sometimes they're convinced they've damaged their knee replacement. Other times they're afraid they've somehow erased weeks of hard work. Those thoughts are completely understandable, but they're usually based on one assumption that simply isn't true. And that's the belief that progress should happen in a smooth, predictable, straight line. Most of us naturally expect improvement to work that way. If yesterday was better than the day before, it seems reasonable to expect that today should be even better. We imagine that once we're moving in the right direction, every day should bring another small improvement. Our bodies really don't heal according to a perfectly straight line. They respond to stress, they need rest, then they adapt, they recover, and sometimes they remind us that they've been asked to do a little more than they're ready to handle. Those responses create days that feel encouraging and other days that feel frustrating, even though the overall direction may still be moving forward. One of the biggest challenges after knee replacement isn't simply regaining strength or improving your walking. It's learning how to interpret what your knee is telling you. Your knee communicates through stiffness, swelling, fatigue, and discomfort, but it doesn't explain why those things are happening. That's where our minds tend to fill in the blanks. If your knee suddenly feels worse, it's easy to assume something must be wrong. In reality, your knee is often responding exactly the way we would expect after a major surgery. It's reacting to the total amount of work it's been doing, not necessarily to one specific event that happened earlier that day. That's an important distinction because many people spend a tremendous amount of energy trying to identify one activity that caused their setback. And you know what? Sometimes there is one activity, and oftentimes you can figure it out because you'll have pain immediately following. But people often remember walking around the grocery store or taking a slightly longer walk after dinner and assume that must be the reason that their knee feels worse today. While a single activity absolutely can certainly contribute, it's much more common for your knee to respond to the accumulation of everything you've asked it to do over several hours or even several days. A walk through the neighborhood, standing while preparing meals, making extra trips up and down the stairs, running errands, carrying groceries, and spending more time on your feet may all seem perfectly manageable on their own. Together, however, they represent a much larger workload than any one activity by itself. One of the reasons this catches people by surprise is that their knee doesn't always respond immediately. You might spend the day feeling reasonably comfortable and assume everything went well, only to wake up the following morning wondering what happened. The delay often leads people to believe they slept in the wrong position or somehow injured their knee overnight, when in reality they're simply seeing the effects of everything their knee joint experienced in the previous day or days. Their body's response to activity isn't always immediate, and understanding that delayed response helps explain why the timing of symptoms can sometimes feel unpredictable. Swelling is often the biggest factor behind these temporary changes, even when the increase is relatively small. Many people think swelling only affects how their knee looks, but it influences much more than that. As fluid increases within the joint, bending and straightening your knee can become more difficult. Walking may feel less natural, and everyday movements that seemed fairly easy a day earlier can suddenly require much more effort. It's easy to interpret those changes as loss of progress, but that's rarely what's happening. Something else is occurring at the same time that most people never notice. Even modest amounts of swelling inside your knee can interfere with how effectively your quadriceps muscle group contracts. Physical therapists refer to this as arthrogenic muscle inhibition, which is a protective response of the nervous system following joint injury or surgery. Rather than reflecting a sudden loss of strength, the muscle simply isn't being recruited as efficiently because the joint is irritated. Recent clinical commentary has reinforced that restoring quadriceps activation remains one of the central challenges after knee surgery, and that joint swelling can temporarily limit how well those muscles perform. When you understand that process, hopefully it changes the way you interpret a difficult day. Instead of believing you suddenly become weaker, it becomes easier to recognize that your nervous system is responding to a knee that's temporarily more irritated. The muscle itself hasn't disappeared overnight, and the work you've put in building strength has not been erased. What you're experiencing is likely a temporary reduction in how effectively that strength is being expressed during movement. That's a very different situation than actually losing muscle. And it's one of the reasons walking can feel surprisingly different from one day to the next. Research following people after total knee replacement also supports something many experienced clinicians have observed for years. Improvement continues over many months, but it doesn't happen at the same pace throughout the entire process. There are periods when changes seem to come quickly, followed by stretches where progress feels slower or even appears to stall for a while before moving forward again. Looking only at a single day can make it seem as though everything has stopped, while looking across several weeks often tells a very different story. Large longitudinal studies consistently show that physical function improves over time, even though individual days can vary considerably. That's why I often encourage people to change the question they're asking themselves. Instead of focusing on how your knee feels today compared to yesterday, it can be much more helpful to compare today with where you were a month ago. That broader perspective usually reveals changes that are easy to overlook when we're focused on one frustrating afternoon. You may notice you're walking farther than you could a few weeks earlier, relying less on a cane, standing more comfortably while preparing meals, or participating in activities that once seemed impossible. Those are meaningful changes, and they provide a much clearer picture of your overall progress than one day when your knee happens to be having a difficult time. And that's not to minimize it. It can be discouraging, but I want you to look at the big picture. So what should you do when you wake up and your knee feels worse than it did yesterday? Start with 3 simple things. First, widen the time frame. Instead of judging your knee by one morning, compare where you are now with where you were a few weeks ago. That shift in perspective can keep one difficult day from taking over the entire story. Second, turn the workload down without turning everything off. A shorter walk, fewer repetitions, or more breaks may be enough to let the irritation settle while you keep some movement in your day. Third, look back before you look forward. Think about the total amount of walking, standing, errands, stairs, and household activity you've done over the past day or two. Your knee may not be reacting to one mistake at all. It may simply be responding to a busier stretch of life than you realized. And that doesn't mean you should ignore a day when your knee feels more uncomfortable than usual. Your knee is giving you information, and it's worth paying attention to. The challenge is learning how to respond without immediately assuming the worst. A difficult day is not a sign that you've failed, and it isn't an invitation to push harder in an effort to make up for lost ground. More often, it's simply a reminder that your body is still adapting and that today's plan may need to look a little different than yesterday's. I often ask people to think about those days as an opportunity to turn the volume down instead of switching everything off. If your knee feels more swollen or more irritable than usual, you don't have to prove anything by forcing yourself through the exact same amount of walking or exercise you completed the day before. At the same time, spending the entire day on the couch because you're afraid of making things worse usually isn't the answer either. Most knees respond well to finding that middle ground where you continue moving, but you reduce the overall workload enough to let the irritation settle. That adjustment may be as simple as shortening a walk, taking more frequent breaks while you're on your feet, or dividing household tasks into smaller pieces or work tasks into smaller pieces instead of trying to finish everything in one afternoon. Those changes can feel almost too simple to make a difference, yet they often allow your knee to settle without giving up the routine you've been working so hard to establish. It's a reminder that successful rehabilitation isn't built on having one perfect day after another. It's built on making good decisions over and over again, especially on the days when your knee isn't at its best. This is also where expectations can influence the way we interpret what we're experiencing. Once people begin noticing improvement, they might naturally expect the next chapter to unfold a little more quickly. They hope the stiffness will disappear for good and that swelling will become a thing of the past, or that every week will feel noticeably easier than the one before. And that's a pretty reasonable expectation if you've not had a knee replacement before. When that doesn't happen, disappointment can creep in because reality doesn't match the picture that people had in their minds. Yet, when researchers have followed people through the months after knee replacement, they've consistently found that improvement unfolds over time rather than in a smooth, uninterrupted climb. There are periods where changes are easy to notice and other periods where they're much more subtle, even though the overall direction continues to be positive. And that pattern is remarkably common, even if it doesn't always feel that way when you're the one living through it. One of the most encouraging things about looking at progress over a longer period is that it shifts your attention away from isolated moments and back toward a larger picture. Instead of asking whether today was a good day or a bad day, you begin noticing that you're doing things now that once seemed out of reach. Perhaps you're standing long enough to cook an entire meal without sitting down. Maybe you're taking your grandchildren to the park, walking through the grocery store without searching for the nearest bench, or enjoying an evening out without wondering whether your knee will allow it. Those moments can arrive so gradually that they're easy to miss, unless you intentionally pause and look back. I also think it's worth remembering that confidence doesn't usually return because one magical day arrives when your knee suddenly feels perfect. Confidence grows because you've experienced enough ups and downs to recognize that a difficult morning doesn't automatically become a difficult month. You begin to notice that your knee can be stiff today, calmer tomorrow, and somewhere in between the day after that without changing the overall direction you're heading. That perspective doesn't remove every frustrating day, but it often changes how much power those days have over you. Of course, there are situations where sudden changes deserve prompt medical attention, and it's important not to ignore those. If you develop increasing redness that's spreading around the incision or even globally around the knee, drainage from the incision, a fever accompanied by significant changes in your knee, severe calf pain with swelling that doesn't improve, or you experience a fall followed by an inability to bear weight, or a dramatic change in the position or function of your knee, those aren't situations where you simply wait and hope things settle down. They deserve a call to your surgeon or immediate medical evaluation. Fortunately, those situations are much less common than the ordinary fluctuations that we've been talking about throughout this episode. For the vast majority of people, a day when their knee feels heavier, stiffer, or more swollen is exactly that. It's one day. It isn't your knee announcing that the operation has stopped working, and it isn't evidence that you've erased weeks of steady effort. More often than not, it's your body responding to the demands that have been placed on it while it continues adapting to one of the biggest orthopedic procedures that you'll likely ever experience. So the next time you wake up and your first few steps don't feel as good as they did yesterday, try to resist the urge to let that single moment define the entire week. Take a step back and ask yourself a little different question. How have things changed over the past month? What am I able to do now that I couldn't do a few weeks ago? Has my knee been asking a little more of me lately than I realized? Those questions usually provide a far more accurate picture than judging your progress by one morning when your knee happens to be reminding you that it's still a work in progress. And perhaps that's the most important thing to remember. Your knee isn't handing you a daily report card. It's responding to the life you're gradually returning to. And some days that response will be a little louder than others. When you learn to recognize that difference, one bad day becomes exactly what it should be. One day in a much longer story. One final thought before we finish today. If you're listening to this because your knee feels worse than it did yesterday, I don't want yesterday to become the standard you measure everything against. Yesterday was a snapshot. Today is another. Neither one tells the whole story by itself. The real story is written over weeks and months. It's found in the distance you can walk now compared with a few months ago. It's found in getting out of a chair without having to think about every movement, climbing stairs with a little less effort, or realizing you've spent an hour enjoying time with your family before your knee even crossed your mind. Those are the changes that deserve your attention because they reflect how your life is gradually expanding, even if today's knee feels a little grumpy. Also want to encourage you to give yourself permission to adjust without feeling as though you're giving up. There will be days when your knee asks for a little less. Listening to that request isn't a sign of weakness. It's part of learning how your body responds to activity, and that understanding becomes one of the most valuable skills you develop after surgery. The goal usually isn't to avoid every setback. The goal is to recognize it for what it is, respond thoughtfully, and then continue moving forward when your knee is ready. If you found today's conversation helpful, I'd love for you to join the Total Knee Success Insider newsletter. Every edition is designed to give you practical, evidence-based education that complements what we talk about here on the podcast. I also share common questions I'm hearing from patients, new research that's worth paying attention to, and simple strategies you can put into practice whether you're preparing for surgery or you're already on the other side of it. You can sign up through the link in the show notes. It's totally free. If you'd like to continue learning beyond the podcast, I've also written Making Sense of Pain After Knee Replacement, which explains why pain, swelling, stiffness, and other symptoms can change from day to day, and Walking Like Yourself Again After Knee Replacement, where I explore why walking can continue to feel awkward even after you're making good progress. Both books are concise and take a deeper dive into questions I hear from patients every day, and you'll find the links to them in the show notes as well. Before I wrap up, I want to leave you with one simple reminder. Your knee doesn't know what day it is. It isn't trying to reward you with a good day or punish you with a difficult one. It's just your knee, and it's responding to the demands you've placed on it while your body continues adapting after surgery. Some days that response will be barely noticeable, and other days it will ask for a little more patience. Neither one tells the whole story. In our next episode, we're going to explore another question I hear pretty frequently. Have I really hit a plateau, or is my knee still changing? Sometimes it feels as though progress has stopped completely, but the story is often much more interesting than that. Thanks for joining me. I'm Michelle, and this has been the Total Knee Success Podcast. This podcast is for educational purposes only. Discover more at totalkneesuccess.com, and be sure to subscribe and share, because every step forward takes you closer to living the life you love.